Hello, and welcome to the first lesson in the ninth fetter. The ninth fetter is the flow fetter, and it is paired with the third fetter. So I can recommend you that before you start on the ninth fetter, that you have already worked with the third fetter, which is very much about the self-care for the non-self. It's about making sure that you are meeting yourself in the 10 different care areas that we are addressing in the third fetter, and that you're meeting them from a need and not from opinions or hopes or expectations. So you exercise daily because it's wonderful, because your body is levitating towards that right now, instead of just sitting on the sofa and doing nothing. And you sit on the sofa and doing nothing because that is what you levitate right now towards, and not because you're depressed and you are procrastinating and you can't, figure out what else to do. So it's really having that fetter dropped before you work with the ninth. It doesn't mean that you can't work with the ninth, because the ninth fetter, as I said, is the flow fetter. And whichever fetter you find yourself in, the material here in the ninth fetter is always helpful, because it is reminding you of getting back to that flow state. Now, what I would like to talk about in this lesson is about the starting point. Because when you're in the ninth fetter, there is no starting point any longer. And let me just walk you through that one. So in the second fetter, we work with the toxic starting point. That is where you react on everything you hear, everything you interact with other people, every thought you have. Everything is coming from one specific starting point. And that is why it's so important to work with the second fetter, because that needs to be dissolved. In some traditions where you work with the fetters, you're told that you can just do therapy after all the fetters have dropped. But we prefer working with it right now, because when you're in therapy, there's a lot of stories created and the story is emphasized. What we like to do in the second fetter is look at what happened without creating stories, but just staying with that experience that you have in the body. So it's a very, very somatic experience, that you notice what your body is experiencing, and you're allowing the body to experience and express without creating any stories about it. You just allow whatever is arising. And when things are allowed to arise, especially things that have been suppressed for decades, then they tend to arise and then be experienced, and then they just dissolve, and it's not an issue anymore. And that is why it's important and it's wonderful to work with the second fetter. The second fetter is the one that you can always return to at any point, and just check in on how you're doing. I love that Todd, he calls the second fetter for the meta fetter. That is where you have self-meta, where you're really looking at all the things that is arising. You're looking at your entire history, all your assumptions about your childhood, your assumptions about yourself. If you have any feeling of low self-worth or doubt or anything like that, then you just allow it to be there, and you stay with the body and stay with the experience. Allow it to grow bigger and take up the entire room, and just be with it. And whatever is there, you just allow to be with it. And then slowly in the other fetters, you start to realize that when you allow that feeling or that emotion to arise and become bigger and bigger and bigger, especially in the sixth fetter, you really become aware that that expansion that you have experienced, it has a center in the middle where there's an experiencer of that experience. And when you, in the seventh fetter, unpin that, you suddenly see that huge expansive experience of pain or low self-worth or fear, anger, guilt and shame or whatever it is that is so huge, when you unpin, you suddenly notice all the space around it. And like Todd, he's writing in his poetry book, Only in Your Mind, he has a beautiful metaphor for that, where he's talking about that he's like in this red room and everything is just red. The sofa is crimson, the table, the walls, everything is just red. Everything is red. But then when he gets into that expansive state of the 7th fetter, where you suddenly unpin and you start to notice everything without a center, but just that expansive experience of everything, that huge red room that he had, it's suddenly just a little red poppy flower on a field where there's like expansive field and mountains and mountain ranges and forest and rivers and all of that, and in all that beautiful expansiveness, there's one little red poppy flower standing in the field. And that is how it is when you allow those sensations to grow and grow, and then start to notice everything that is surrounding that sensation. It really becomes very clear how little that sensation is, even though it felt so big when we had it in our body. When we allow it to expand as big as it can get, it doesn't get any bigger than a little poppy flower in a huge landscape. And when that is experienced and the unpinning has happened and you have had metta for whatever is arising, and in the 2nd fetter is very much about looking at all the traumas that we have and allowing it to be without creating any stories. And when you have had compassion, metta for that part of you, the 4th and the 5th fetter of where you are looking at all the things you want and don't want, and it's very much about pointing fingers at others or blaming, shaming, complaining about others. That is now just a projection of that ick that you feel in yourself. But because you allow that ick to be there, and you allow that ick to get expansive and big as it can get, unpin and suddenly notice everything around it. It's not that big anymore. And that also creates that experience that you have in the 8th fetter, that the little kernel of an eye that is there is nothing but a contraction. And you can be with that contraction and it dissolves like all contractions in the body does. And that leaves us to the 9th fetter, where there is no longer a starting point. There's no longer a preconceived idea about what is happening next. There's no expectations to what will happen next or what should happen next. There's no, if you and I engage in a conversation, there's no expectation of the other person or what should or shouldn't be said or done. All that has completely released, which means there's no starting point. Whatever is arising in this moment is welcome, and whatever is arising is what is right now. And there's no one or no I here that has a need to know what will happen or a need to predict or control anything. There's no sense of low self-worth or low self-esteem or fear, anger, guilt and shame, because if there is, then there's a starting point. And the 9th fetter is very much about noticing that, really putting the headlight and the floodlight on whatever seems to be a starting point. So whenever you have a feeling in your body, be rest assured there is a starting point. There is something in you that either recognize the situation that you're in, not one-to-one, but the sensation or the feeling or something around their situation that seems recognizable and seems to be tickling, fear, anger, guilt, and shame in you. Go back to the second fetter. Really, really work with the second fetter, with all the new insights that you have had, with the new experiences of freedom that you have had, and you will see that the curriculum in the second fetter is completely morphing into the need that you have right now. So whenever you have any kind of ick in the body, it's not the ninth fetter. The ninth fetter is where there is no ick, where there is, and if ick arises and you have worked with it in the second fetter and the fourth and fifth, and you have worked with it in the sixth fetter, that there's no center of it anymore and there's no creating something out of nothing, then it's just how this snapshot of an experience is right now, and the ick is not an issue, because it can only be an issue if it's with a comparison of a previous experience. So the moment just before where you didn't have that icky sensation in the body is compared with this moment right now where you have an icky sensation in the body. And both of those can be experienced on their own as a full moment where nothing needs to happen and nothing needs to be different. But it's just what is arising right now, which means that in this moment there can't be an ick. You see, there can't be anything but what just is right now. If it's not held in any comparison with anything, it's just what is arising right now. And that puts you in that position where there is no starting point. There's no starting point. There's no wish for anything going in a certain direction. There's no need for control. Who is there to control anything, and what actually can you control? It's just what is right now. And this is where the ninth and the third is tied in together. So if you have had issues in the third fetter with meeting your needs when it comes to food and water and sleep and psychological stimulation and intellectual stimulation and spiritual and creative inspiration, if you have had any issues with that, incorporating the ninth fetter in it is super helpful, because it is where you, without a starting point, for example, you can stand in front of a white canvas and just express what arises in this moment. There's no need for it to look in a certain way or be in a certain way. There's no thought of the future of anybody else gonna see it or experience it. It's just this now, right now. You can sit in front of a piano and you can express yourself on the piano, and there's no thoughts about that it should sound in a certain way or be in a certain way. It's just this, what is coming up right now, what is expressed right now. And there's no hooks into it, anything being any different than what it is right now. So what is super helpful with the ninth fetter is also really observe what is happening. And we've done this a lot when you've had the inquiry groups, and also when we had the embodiment retreat, that we put the music on that Todd has made, and then you start to move to the music, and then you notice that the entire job is not so much moving to the music. It's more about noticing who is commenting on the way that you move, who is commenting on the way that you express yourself, or the way you dress, or the way you are in this moment, of what you eat, if you exercise or do not exercise. Who is it that is commenting? And can you just allow that critical voice to be there and going like, thank you. And that's it. You do not need to believe it in any way. Toddy has that amazing metaphor that if you have a random thought of, a purple dragon, there's no visceral need to do anything about that thought. It's just a thought of a purple dragon. It doesn't mean anything. But if you have a thought about something your dad said or something that your mom did, then that thought is accompanied with a visceral experience. So there's a contraction in the body, and it's that thought with the contraction in the body that makes this feel more real or more actual than just a thought of a purple dragon. So really noticing what is it that is happening in this moment right now, because the moment you have any type of visceral experience, there is a starting point. There is a and with a starting point, I also mean that there's a very predictable road that you're on your way down of right now, and there's a very, very predictable end point, end station when you have a starting point. But in the ninth fetter, there's none of that. It's just the pure being in the moment, because there can't be anything else. If there's anything else, there's hooks into any of the other fetters that really needs your compassion and your kindness. Another thing that I also want to say is that when you then have, insights about this being about another fetter, one of the lower fetters that needs your work, like we talked about in the last lesson in the eighth fetter, be compassionate towards that judgment that you might have that is telling you that this is linear and you cannot go back. You cannot go back and work with the sixth fetter or fourth fetter or third fetter or second fetter, because that is beneath you. You are now in the ninth fetter and there's nothing left for you to look at there. That thought is about permanence, and nothing is permanent. Nothing is permanent. Whatever insight you had, and that was a peak experience, a peak insight. Then when you start to live your life and that becomes integrated part of your life, another layer of the onion is ready to get peeled. And of course, you have to go back and look at, okay, so this turn on the kaleidoscope that I just did has created a completely different picture. Of course, you need to go back. Wherever the body is telling you that there is a hiccup, you need to go back and sort it out. Not create a big story about it and not make it into a big deal, but just being with whatever is arising in this moment. Otherwise, you are spiritually arrogant and you believe in permanence. You believe that things that has changed stay changed. Of course they can't, because that would mean, first of all, a permanence, but it will also mean a linearity, which we don't have since time do not exist. In this moment right now, there's just this moment right now. It will also mean that there is someone that had insights, that now that someone should act in life as if they have had those insights. Who is that someone that can experience that? And the last thing it's pointing to is that discontentment that we tend to have as human beings. There's nothing that is never satisfying in any way. It might be satisfying right now, but then something happens and then it's not satisfying anymore. And all of it is pointing you to the foundational fetters, to the fetter first, 1, 2, and 3. Back to those foundational fetters, because there's still something there that needs sweeping. There's something that needs to be felt and experienced and looked into. And again, it needs to be done without any stories. Just an insight, an acknowledgement, and okay, yeah, I get it. And just stay with it, and it's not an issue anymore. So there is no inherent reality to a starting point. Reality always unfolds naturally in the present moment, without any need for striving or expectations. And by turning into the current state of being and making contact with the sensory experiences, flow will happen from a space where decisions are based on a present need for rest and nourishment and exercise and meditation. And that is where the knowledge that you have in the third fetter of the self-care for the non-self is so relevant. And if you have any perceived obstruction to going back to the third fetter, any perceived destruction about the need for nourishment or exercise and meditation and water and rest, if that is happening, then the issue is not lying in the unfolding in the moment, but with that identification that you have with an expectation. There's a present awareness for what feels right in the moment, without the pressure of any internal or external expectation or preferences. And the other thing I would like to talk about is also here in the flow fetter. It's about that ease that life is. Life is easy and life is uncomplicated. There is nothing that is making anything complicated in itself. There's no inherent nature to this present moment. So life is easy and uncomplicated. The moment that things start to get complicated, or things start to feel like it's not going like it should, there is an expectation to what that moment should be. There is a starting point that I left at home to be at work at 8, and now there's, traffic jam. That was not supposed to happen. Now I'm late. Then they're going to say this and that, and they're going to think this and that. There's a starting point. Dissolve all that. There is an unfolding happening in this moment right now. And I think that one of the reasons why the 8 fetter is so difficult for so many people to work with, because you're completely dissolving all beliefs. You're completely dissolving all hooks into having any kind of foundation to stand on. All that is just dissolved. And I think that is the most difficult thing to work with in the 8th, 9th, and 10th fetter, because there is nothing left for you to lean on. There is nothing that you can rest on. There is no there's no justification happening. If you're late for a meeting, you're not defending yourself and you're not justifying. You are apologizing for the other people that were sitting and waiting. You create space for all the complaints that they have about you and all the things that come up in them with what they experience while sitting and waiting and what they think about you and all of that, because they're talking about their own bubble of reality. So you have no need to defend yourself. You have no need to explain yourself. You create an open space where you listen and you create compassion and you are there for them and they are allowed to say everything they need to say. And okay, should we get on with the meeting? When it's all of them have landed in a space where they have got all of that frustration out. You never know what is happening in other people, but you're very much aware that it's not about you. And people can point fingers and say whatever they want about you, and you're completely fine with it. You have no hooks into them perceiving in you in a certain way, of them praising you, appreciating you. There's no hooks into that. You're setting people free to be who they are, and there's no starting point in reality having to be in a certain way. You completely allow everything that is happening right now to unfold as it is unfolding. And it's not a forcefulness that is happening. It's more a deep accepting and understanding of this is anyway. This moment is unfolding as it is anyway. If I'm struggling and fighting against it, it doesn't change anything. The suffering is in me. I'm the only one who feels that suffering. If I do not fight and struggle against it, it is unfolding as it is unfolding. and just going with that flow. So you're very, very much clear on that there's no decision made ever. It is causes and conditions. It was causes and conditions that made you click on this video, causes and conditions that make you still sit and listen to this maybe for the 4th and the 5th or the 6th time. It's causes and conditions, which means that all guilt is vanished. All shame is vanished, because there is nothing and no one to blame or to complain about or to shame. When there's no starting point, there's nowhere where those labels can land, because they need something to land on, and that there needs to be a starting point for them to land. If there's just an open acceptance of what is arising in this moment, there's not even the wish for it not to arise. So if you get contractions in the body, somebody says, you're late, and always like that with you, you're always late, and you feel a contraction in your body, you notice that this is a contraction in the body. Period. Nothing more to talk about. There's nothing more to do. If you have any type of reaction to it, defending yourself or yelling or shouting or anything, back to the lower fives. When you feel the need for justification, and when we react like with anger or yelling or defending, explaining or defending ourselves in any way, there is someone that needs to be defended. There's still a sense of vulnerability that can be injured. And that means there's still something locked in the body that needs to be loved and experienced and expressed, and allow it to arise, stay with it, do the 7 Fetter time travel if you need to, and just allow it to go as big as it can, and then unpin and notice the vastness around it, and you will see it just shrinks to being just a little blip, and you can be with that. You can be with that. Yeah. So just to circle back, whenever things start to get complicated, then just leave it. It's not for now. Life is easy and things are easy. So when it's not, then ego is involved. You are self-referential, and you need to step back and leave it and allow it to solve itself. And it really puts you in that position that when you are in flow, you allow the situation to be as it is. You allow whatever is arising to be as it is. There's no ego that need to control or manage or steer the situation into something else. There's a deep, deep acknowledgement of that is not possible. It cannot be steered anyway. And anywhere. It is as it is. It is arising as it is. And there's nothing complicated in what is happening. The complication arises with the thoughts about it, and with the expectation and the wishes for things not to be the way that you perceive them to be in this moment. It doesn't mean that the situation is as you perceive it, you know? It just means that you are perceiving it in a certain way. And that perception can be seen through and released. And yeah, I think that was it. Life is easy. Life is flow. And there's no starting point anywhere. And I think the last thing I would just like to remind you of is a beautiful quote by Lao Tzu, where he says, softness over hardness, allowing over forcing, flowing over striving. And that's the 9th Fetter. Thank you.